I met Dr. Green his first semester in social analysis, and it was a game-changing experience for me. Since that time, I have seen Dr. Green perform or have performed with Dr. Green in multiple settings. In addition to class, I have seen him preach, worked with colleagues in my context of corporate America, and have witnessed his belly laugh at a comedy show. Dr. Green is uniquely gifted in his ability to help others see, and see in a way that activates. Dr. Green earned his PhD from Bright Divinity School, where he focused on issues related to young African-American men through the lens of public pastoral theology. His dissertation, which is entitled Playing the Game, Unmarking Beasts from the Bodies of Young Black Men, is a project that seeks to humanize young Black men by allowing their voices to challenge stereotypical scripts that cast them as beasts for public consumption. Dr. Green is an ordained minister who has served the Black church and has facilitated public conversations about theology, sport, and justice. He believes these critical conversations can help religious leaders and leaders of all types recognize the complexities of privilege and oppression, both inside and outside the church. Dr. Green also has a passion for comedy, music, and film. He is a former athlete and loves to watch sports with family. But above all, his favorite thing to do is spend time with his wife, Monica, and their 2 young children. I'm excited for us all to get a taste of Dr. Green's unique talents tonight, and will guarantee we leave here seeing and thinking differently. Dr. Green, thank you for bringing your gifts to United and for enabling me to see in new and different ways. I'm looking forward to this evening. Dr. Green.
Can y'all hear me okay? All right. First of all, thank you, Jeff, a student, a friend, and colleague for that introduction. Thank you, Molly, for not only, well, for joining the shenanigans at United and the troublemaking that we invited you into. It's an honor to be present tonight. You see that I have Anansi here. Shout out to my daughter, Ella. Thank you, baby girl, for giving me this to bring to my office. I love you. Thank you to Monica for sending that wonderful picture of her and the kids to let me know that everything is okay tonight, because this is still trying to roll out of the proverbial bed from being on parental leave. So it's good to be here tonight. I want to tell you a story. And I know that I'm supposed to give a lecture tonight. And you can ask my students how I feel about the tradition and politics and of a lecture as a means of learning. But the invitation was for me to give my favorite lecture, which means I take license to stretch that category and play a little bit. But this story does capture in ways that I hope are not exclusively academic, and in fact, I intend them not to be. My current attempt to make sense of my own and other Black men's experiences in the United States, with the hopes to shed light on avenues of social transformation that may be lurking just beneath our noses. Now, a few caveats. First of all, if you know me and you've heard me preach, especially back in the day, you know that I have a knack for trying to say it all. And I know that I cannot say it all. And consequently, a lot of things that I really wanted to include, I could not. So if I go down a rabbit hole, please just understand that I have not had an opportunity to have adult interaction in quite some time, and so I might get a little happy. Also, I'm teaching a preaching class right now. Shout out to my students in PM 2003. Plus, I'm still, again, getting reacclimated to this regular kind of interaction, not to mention talking about a topic that I've really been thinking about all my life. So if this lecture sounds sermonic at times, please just be warned. Go ahead and click. When I think about my experiences in this country, I can't help but to always go back to something my dad used to tell me when I was a kid. Son, you have to know how to play the game. And you may not know offhand what this phrase means, but I was never confused by it. I knew exactly what he meant by the time we started having these conversations. I knew that it meant there was a political design to my existence in this country. I knew that I had to temper any freedom I felt or wanted to live into with an experience near awareness of the rules and the ways I could quickly go out of bounds. I knew that always paying attention to, if not micromanaging, my public performance in the world was one of my greatest strategies and assets to maximizing my chances to survive. The idea, though, that we are experiencing something, specifically that Black men are experiencing something that is in some way a game, or worse, a kind of play, especially when I think about the cultural onslaught that becomes clear when looking at the circumstances and struggles of Black men and women in this country. It just seems absurd to me to think about this as a game. It is an absurdity that a whole reality could be constructed that is designed to disempower and dehumanize Black men based on a politically concocted and convenient idea that was encoded into a myth and has thus become a material reality. It is this absurdity that has galvanized my analytical attention and my transformative energy because of just how simultaneously silly and sickening this reality is, but also from the slippage that dances around right in front of us when we are confronted with the complex, beautiful, and full-bodied humanity of Black men and women in the United States. The problem is, as I see it, one of them at least, is that society has not been given the mechanisms or the opportunity to recognize Black humanity. And yet we play along. I play along, code switching in public space so as not to ruffle feathers in different areas. Going out of my way when leaving the gym, especially in Minnesota winters when it gets dark at 4:30, 5 o'clock, not to walk right behind a white woman, but to go all the way around the parking lot just to play along with the rules that I know are written on the surface on which we walk and live. We play along with these things in ways that we know and in ways that we don't yet know. We perform these rituals and these routines in ways that recreate this thing that we call reality. But the problem with playing along is precisely that it participates in the reproduction of the very realities we say we want to transform. See, by now you've heard me say the word reality several times. This is intentional. I am using this concept analytically because it helps me paint a fuller picture of what I think are both the tragic and comedic circumstances in which we live. And I'll unpack that a little bit later. So don't think that this is being cast as something that we laugh at, although it is laughable when we analyze it. We tend to imagine reality in static terms as something that exists independent of human participation and with a fixed boundary that circumscribes human life, that human existence and all that we know and learn about it somehow happens within or in reference to a realm we refer to as real. The very act of acknowledging something as real is meant to legitimate, talking culturally here, is meant to legitimate its existence by naming it as such, thereby casting it into a category similar to fact or nature. and appealing to these categories as justification. If something is real, its existence is not in question, it just is. Common phrases like giving somebody a reality check, or the reality is, or even the notion of bringing somebody back down to reality are all colloquialisms that reveal this deeper cultural assumption that there exists called reality, to which we can apolitically refer in order to name some underlying truth or nature of something. But reality is not something that exists independent of human participation or the meaning we bring to it. Realities, no matter how seemingly automatic they are relational processes that live in constant productive motion and extend continuously from the variety of ways human beings relate to one another in ritualized patterns of performance that we then structure, name, and relate to as if it were already. To call out the reality of something is to recognize that any nature we assume it has is secondary to the coordinated movements that make it so. So what is reality? And why am I using this term? I'm using this intentionally as a way to push past studying Black men in context, which assumes that Black men, and when you look at the self or when you look at a person, you can understand them just by seeing what their race is, or their gender, or their sexuality, or their class, or whatever institutions they might relate to and how. But there's something more gray, there's something more in motion, there's an interworking that I'm trying to point to, that stuff that isn't often identified. Go ahead, Kyle. Go ahead and flip past this one. What is reality? This is a very simplistic definition that I'm going to use, and really this is a teaching definition. So if you want to scrutinize it, we can have a conversation later, because it's not this simple, but it kind of is. Reality is an ongoing production born from the ritualized interplay of policy and performance. Let me start with performance. What do I mean by performance? I mean, in a real straightforward way, to perform literally means to bring to fruition completely. If I stand up out of a chair, it is a performance. If I sit down, it is a performance. When I speak, it is a performance. And one of the major misconceptions of performance is that, especially when we look at the performance of everyday life and culture, is that if somebody is performing, they must be inauthentic or fake. Think of the way that we police other people's behavior in the world by rendering what they're doing or saying fake. And built within this claim, built within this is an assumption that the authentic self I am is such because it's the one that I have to try the least hard to be. Right? So an actor puts on a performance or puts on a face to depict a character that they're really not. And if we have this understanding that this happens in everyday life, we assume it means inauthenticity. But really, when I understand the self that I have become, or that we have become, or looking culturally at the systems that have settled into place, I've just gotten really good at being this version of me. And it doesn't make it no less a performance. We are always performing. Performance is commonplace, and every performance is consequential in that it is accomplishing something. But policy is the other part of this that I want to hold together. And again, this is just a way to kind of break open this conversation so that some of the ideas we talk about later will land different. By policy, and I use that in quotes because I'm not using it in the strict sense of a formal policy written, but policy refers to the ways we dictate or orient our performances in order to produce culture. This is something known intuitively and explicitly. Policies are essentially the scripts, written and unwritten, that tell actors what role they are to play in the overall production of cultures or reality. And you know how this plays out. The policies of this institution or the laws or the norms or best practices in the corporate world, or we don't do that here at grandmother's house. In a nutshell, I'm using policy in this way to talk about the variety of ways that we police our own performances, and we police performances culturally, among others. Now, I like this diagram, and it kind of illustrates what was also built within the picture that I had of Ella and Monica earlier in the slides. But there's this kind of mutual, life-giving reciprocity, if you will, of policy and performance, right? And there's this rhythmic pattern that by the time it becomes a reality has virtually disappeared in front of our faces. Here's an illustration. The picture was when we went home to visit my family for Christmas a couple of years ago, I think when Ella was 3 years old. Monica sat down on one of the stairs to tie her shoe. And this particular situation was the first time Ella stopped to pay attention to somebody tying their shoes. Now, she watched, and she tried to help out, and Monica was coaching her through, you do this, you do a loop here, you pull this through, and Ella was paying attention. Now, Monica can tie her shoes. She doesn't have to think about how to tie her shoes. Most of us can tie our shoes, and most of us don't remember when we first learned how to tie our shoes or when we first successfully did it, right? But we know how to tie our shoes. I know how to secure my shoes on my feet, and it is pretty much second nature at this point. But when I look at my daughter, I look at the fact that it begins in this intentional, practical need of learning how to navigate the world, learning how to navigate putting my shoes on, because that's what they say you're supposed to do before you leave the house. And one of these days, she will be able to tie her shoes, and she will forget when she first successfully did it. But she will still know how to do it, and it will not cease to be a performance that is done in a particular way to bring about a particular way of doing something, a culture or a reality, if you will, to the way I tie my shoes. Now, I like this, and I do I enjoy this reflective activity that we did in class last week, I think it was, where you ask somebody about one of their routines. Right? What is one of your silly routines? Blah, blah, blah. And specifically routines that require the coordination of somebody else or a number of people. And you peel back the layers to try to help them see what the original need was for the creation of this routine. What this diagram illustrates, however, is how something can begin with a practical need. And I do it in a particular way. And I do it again and again, until a rhythm is created. And a rhythm kind of feels good, and it's kind of getting smooth to me. I'm no longer really having to try as hard, becomes a routine that then evolves into a ritual. And by the time, one of the questions I love to ask is when we think about the routines, whether it's for getting out the door in the morning or whatever it might be, especially those that require other people's participation. One of the questions is, well, what is one thing that they could do that would disrupt the routine? And then they name, you don't wash the coffee cups and I can't make the coffee, whatever it is. And then the question is, well, do you get mad? Why, or why do we get upset sometimes when our way of doing things is frustrated by the participation of somebody who is supposed to help us keep this rhythm going? And my argument is that, and this is one of those parts where I left some slides out, so we can unpack it a little bit more later. But by the time something has become sacred in and of itself, a way of being in the world, a way of looking at the world, a way of performing in relation to this person or that person, it ceases to become about whatever the practical need was in the first place, and more about the way that we have settled into doing this in this coordinated way. Now, there are 3 levels of analysis or attention, that at least 3, that we can pay to this. or reality plays out in this way on at least three levels. There is institutional, and we are aware of some of the institutions that regularly get talked about when we talk about Black men's survival and hopes to flourish in this country. Whether it is the prison industrial complex, whether it is one of the ones that I think is still overlooked, but what I would call the athletic industrial complex, or the variety of institutional ways in which Black men continue to be caught in this country. Playing along allows structural realities to flow and remake themselves unchecked. Political and economic institutions can continue to coordinate to preserve the social order or reality as it is, and it is a flow. Because no matter how seemingly fixed into place these and their coordination seem to be, they still exist as ritualized ways of being in relation that we've gotten so good at that we have built into institutions. But then there are cultural consequences for playing along, because playing along with cultural scripts communicates and creates a culture that says this is okay. It is permissible to use this language because it is so popular. You just can't mean harm by it. One of the ones that conversations that I'm listening to right now is the way that team monikers in sports, some are undergoing revision and some are not. And there are strong feelings about why a certain team should be able to maintain this Native American slur as something that they want to honor because it honors our history, right? Unchecking that cultural performance not only allows the practice to continue, which does exploit and disenfranchise indigenous populations, believe it or not, but it also allows the political underbelly that was the reality when these slurs took hold to come forward with the use of the language and the practices and the way of relating that they invite us into. But relational is one that I want to, excuse the quote missing. Relational is one of the ones that I wish we had more time to talk about, but really we are formed relationally. Straight through obligation all the way down to desire. If you think about some of the rituals that we find ourselves into, some of the performance, some of the ways of being that we get so committed to, these things take on an emotional life of their own for us. Ritual lives beyond the level of how should I say? Well, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. The point here is that these things play out at least institutional, cultural, and relational levels. Go ahead, Kyle. Now, I want to briefly, before I go into the next part of this presentation, which focuses specifically on the ideas that I hope will land differently after thinking about reality, not as something that exists a priori or just comes to us automatically, but something that is produced based on coordinated, ritualized performances that we settle into in a sacred kind of way. As I consider how a fiction like Beast could shape persons so thoroughly at levels of emotion, intuition, or desire, it raises for me the issue of legibility, which connects to the issue of scripts and the fact that there are cultural scripts that we continue to play out. Legibility denotes the level to which something is recognizable. We know this. For instance, a person's handwriting is deemed legible if someone else can understand it. But the very process of understanding points to an agreement shared by both parties. Without this agreement, neither the writer or the reader, nor the reader, will know the rules of this exchange or the grounds on which they can communicate. So legibility is never a neutral process. It imposes a norm that reinforces itself by requiring communicators to adhere to certain rules of interpretation. Legibility should be understood as a political process by which one's sight is continually adjusted and attuned. And this adjustment and this attunement does not happen in a vacuum. It is always performed in relation to a norm that must be maintained. And what is often overlooked in what relational performance or this understanding of reality reveals is how this adjustment process happens as a result of the routine performances of roles in society, particularly as these performances play out the scripts meant to set the terms for what will or who will be recognizable publicly and how. Go ahead, Kyle. The script that I am most concerned with when I think about the survival and freedom of Black men in the United States is Beast. Beast is a myth that continues to write scripts and write reality, and these are played out in public space, and the evidence is clear. You do not kneel on somebody's neck for that long and believe in your heart of hearts that they are a human. Go ahead, Kyle. Beast as an intersectional construction, right? Constructed on the basis of race, class, gender, and sexuality. Black men were cast as overly sexualized brutes who were good for breeding and labor, but ultimately needed the control of white men so as not to become a menace on the plantation, and in a more contemporary sense, to society. And that is written that way intentionally if you've seen the movie. Go ahead, Kyle. Beast was constructed with political necessity, and I would argue is still politically necessary and still plays out publicly in ways that have become celebrated over and against the way we might look historically at the more explicitly racist ways that Black men are rendered inhuman or subhuman. It's used as it was used historically, a brief history, used as a foundational belief to justify the institution of slavery. And more specifically, looking at what that reality was actually an institutional exploitation and dehumanization of Black male and female bodies, because that's all they were considered to be. Black humanity did not exist in the public mind, despite the lived reality of Black people who were here. And this was a product of the political play among colonizers. But then you also have this kind of evolution of this image of beast that was concocted to justify enslavement, that by the time Jim Crow rolls around and there is now a need for a different kind of control and a different kind of policing of Black bodies, particularly Black male bodies, beast had to take on a new form once enslavement and the interaction or the interplay of policies and performances that defined enslavement were no longer legal. So then you have Birth of a Nation that is born, the film, and I intended to put a picture of it on there, but did not have time. Birth of a Nation is known for the way that it recreated a cultural script of Black men as over-sexualized, out-of-control beasts who were in pursuit of white women, and along with the recreation of this myth, constructed also this public image and understanding that white women needed to be afraid of Black men. And the facts don't bear out that there was really a reason for that fear. In fact, well, yeah, I'm not gonna do that. But there was a way of, during Jim Crow, playing up the lasciviousness or the perceived looseness or the out of controlness, which then evolved into thuggery, right? Criminality that gets written onto Black bodies as an inherent trait, right? That at the end of the day, no matter how cooperative somebody might be, at base, they are a beast. And today, in this neoliberal capitalist reality, you can see beast on display in everything from political advertising campaigns to porn. It plays out everywhere. Whether or not we recognize it, whether or not we consume or regurgitate it, it is there. And it continues to be a script that seeks to write reality, just in a new way, using different language. Go ahead, Kyle. What I would say the climax or the culmination of Beast as I see it playing out currently is epitomized by Marshawn Lynch, Beast Mode. You think about the popularity and the payout that is created by this image that also creates aspirations, remember, shaping and forming desire, shaping aspirations of young men and women who are then aspiring to the stardom and the financial security wrought by living into this image, whether they want to live into it or not. Here's a caveat. You talk about performance, and one of the pieces about performance or one of the nuances that I think is important is that you can look at the performance of what I do, right? How I show up in a space, what I say, my movements, how I interact or how I relate. Unfortunately, this script also undergirds the performance of my body, regardless of how I show up in public space. Right? A Black male body performs double duty in public, regardless. And now all the code switching in the world, whether you're Henry Louis Gates in a suit trying to get into your house, it does not matter, because the interactions are undergirded by these cultural scripts that we carry and not even know it. Go ahead, Kyle. Oh, this was one of those multiple click ones. I highlighted this because if you look up, at least when I looked this up a couple months ago, on Spotify, the top workout playlist is Beast Mode, right? People use this phrase Beast Mode or beasting in and out of sport. It left the field, but unfortunately, it cannot leave Black men's bodies, even when they walk off the field. And I'll talk about that here shortly. But even Beast is a commodified celebration and really a fetishization of Black men. It's the superhumanity that we hold in tension with the subhumanity in order to still not have to confront the full humanity of Black men in America. There is still a script. You think about Colin Kaepernick's protest, right? Of trying to use his platform to make a statement, to disrupt reality as it is, to open up the possibility of something different. And I hear the phrase sons of bitches come to mind from former President Donald Trump. Or from Bob McNair, president or owner of the Houston Texans, we can't have the inmates running the prison, in response to the protests that Colin Kaepernick and company began. You see LeBron James, and immediately I hear shut up and dribble, which was said to him in response by a Fox News anchor after he is rightfully critiquing the racist antics of former President Donald Trump. And you see Marshawn Lynch, who was regularly termed a thug when he launched his own creative media protests after being forced to give interviews where he himself has talked about the way that reporters, they ask questions to try to create narratives about these athletes, and the questions have nothing to do with what is important in a nutshell. Go ahead, Kyle. Not only is there a full and beautifully complex humanity within this skin, but there is an embodied brilliance that Beast does not let us see. In fact, it is designed to prevent us from seeing. I've embedded this video and I want to watch it and just kind of unpack it real quick because it gives us an insight into a way to appreciate. This is the run that made Beast Mode and Marshawn Lynch's nickname Beast Mode go viral. Okay, so let's watch this and then I'll say something about it briefly. Did you hear the way that he talked about the guard pulling? He thought he was going to go backside, but it carried him front side. Or the way that he negotiated the bodies that were moving in speed and in space. the way that he talked about how he knew even the slightest stiff arm would break him free because of the angle and the speed at which he and the other defender were running. There is all kinds of analysis happening in real time, right? It is not just an animalistic physical talent that has been so well corralled by a coach to run and do something like this. And it's not just brute force. There's a blend of force and finesse that requires really a kind of neurological overachievement, if you will. A brilliance, Molly, an embodied brilliance that is on display in ways that are seemingly obvious, and yet because of the persistence of this cultural script, it gets read as, man, he's just a beast, or a freak of nature, or whatever it might be. Go ahead, Kyle. To the next one. And actually, before I read this quote from a good friend, Amir Abdullah, who currently plays for the Carolina Panthers, it's interesting. I would encourage you to listen to Marshawn Lynch's own analysis and own definition of what beast mode means. Despite the fact that it's read in light of this kind of historical trope, Marshawn Lynch himself describes beast mode more like flow, right? And if you look up, there's a lot of flow research from Stephen Kotler. There's the book called The Sports Gene by David Epstein. These thinkers and several others, they break down the kind of neurological pathways, the neurological responses, that really the kind of literally measurable, brilliant activity that is happening in the brain that occasions outstanding athletic achievement. This is a quote from Amir Abdullah during a conversation where I was talking about how good it felt as an athlete to be called a beast, and really asking several athletes, how does it feel if your fans, your peers, or your coaches refer to you as a beast? And overwhelmingly, it feels good. It means that I'm doing well, right? Amir was one who said, I really never liked the term beast. I never really liked it personally, just because I think it kind of discredits a little bit of, well, it doesn't thoroughly explain the process of a lot of the hard work it takes to be successful. Just calling somebody a beast sometimes just says like, oh man, he's just different. He's just different. Read A Freak of Nature. And of course, everyone's different. Some people have the ability to do other things that some people don't. That makes someone more athletically inclined, but it's a lot of hard work to becoming a beast. If you want to be a beast, you got to be strong. That means he works his ass off in the weight room. He's conditioning like crazy. And if you know Amir, you know that he is working constantly to hone his craft. It's so much more than just physical talent. And one of the things I love that he said is, I think devoted is a better term. That's a devoted individual. A person that puts his mind to something and was like, nah, I'm not going to stop until this has been achieved. And that is echoed in Marshawn Lynch's own interviews about beast mode. And yet we continually consume and regurgitate images like mugshots and marketing ads that tell a story about animalistic talent that is capable of producing, but is unfortunately devoid of something deeper. That lens adjustment continues to happen. Fortunately, Molly, play is a double entendre. And if this was a Baptist church, the organ person would be going over to get prepared for the tune. But play is a double entendre. And paying attention to the other meaning of play opens up the possibility for new realities to be constructed. Play is by definition to be off script. Play cannot be defined, and of course scholars have tried to. Play is fun, pleasurable, unencumbered. A friend recently reminded me that play is also autotelic. doing something just for the sake of doing it with no external goal or reasoning to do it. That's the purpose of it. And we all know play, don't we? The little wink in the middle of a serious conversation to lighten the mood, the office prank to break up the monotony of the workday, the jokes me and my cousins tell when we carry the tradition of our fathers and the men before them who loved to play the dozens. We all know how to play. But play is also disruptive. Play lives outside the flow of reality. It exists as a portal of possibility. It refers more closely to the world of what we might call fantasy than reality, where there's a possibility of ideas and ways of being born in the context of play that we hope maybe we can take back to the real world, but sometimes we can't. And it's still productive to be able to engage these performances as ways to nurture who we are becoming. And we know this in the lives of children. Unfortunately, we denigrate play in the context of children, and we forget that when we become adults, we still form ourselves by play. We just don't leave much room for it. So this informs what is, for me, a comedic approach. I look at this with a comedic lens, and I'm not going to get into the particulars, but there are particulars for why I approach this through comedy. But the purpose is, or the point is absurdity. A comedian can see what's going on, some might believe, because they don't take reality too seriously. They move with the assumption that all this is made up, so let's just play with it. Better yet, I would suggest that they take it more seriously by not resigning to merely relate to it as is or as told to do, but rather using curiosity to cut past the BS to an understanding of its interworking and to find a creative way to lay it bare for all to see. And the best comedians can do this with the most basic, mundane daily interactions that we engage without thinking about it. They do this with hopes that something might change, or at least we might be able to better cope with it. The old phrase, laughter is medicine, and I think transformation is the cure. Now, I wanted to show some stand-up comedy clips, but this is a seminary and I'm not sure Richard Pryor would be welcome. So see me after class if you would like to see how this plays out in real time. But again, the point is absurdity. The location of something that makes no logical sense and the commitment to not only expose it, but in so doing to disrupt its flow. Disruption wrought by play opens the possibility for new ways of being by upending the logic of what currently is. And there's a theological significance to this as well. Go ahead, Kyle. Dwight Hopkins in Being Human talks about the trickster. The trickster acts out the notion of human reversal in which usually the weak character, in parentheses, that is poor and working class Black folk, deploys the weapon of wit to out owner of material resources, that is elite rights with power, is what he says. He goes on to say the liberating art of the trickster through reversal, offering hope to the weak with superior wit over the strong and thereby suggesting a human flourishing, is not automatically inherent to the oppressed sectors of the human family. It transcends them. But because of their weak social location in the structures of power and privilege, or I would say in relation to the structures of power and privilege, they are relatively more open to the possibilities of transforming both the individual self and collective selves. Now, I was thinking about this, and I take issue with one part of it, but before mentioning that, I want to talk about Jesus as a comedian, right? And to talk about the way that this plays out in real time. This is a passage from Matthew 22:15, 22. And it says, then the Pharisees, now put on your comedic lens and play with me for a second. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap him in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth and show deference to no one," buttering him up. "For you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites?" Now, I would translate that to, are you seriously trying to play me right now? This is what's happening. You talk about the double entendre. "Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. Now, if we had more time, I would show you 3 or 4 more passages where Jesus is exposing the absurdity upon which these practices and these beliefs have been built. And one of the quickest phrases is "love your enemies." You talk about upending cultural logic at the time and still. Love your enemies, disrupting the political, theological, and cultural logic that pose problems for the least of these, thereby opening the possibility for new ways of being in relation. Now, what we've done with that influence in the colonial world that must still be deconstructed is a different story for another day. But this is another way to look at the function of disruption, and really what leads into what could become a theology of disruption that takes seriously the possibility of play. Now, I agree with Hopkins that there is a spirit of liberation that enlivens the disruptive performances that break open the possibility for the inbreaking of creativity, capital C, and the breathing of via the performances that have become second nature to us. But I disagree with the idea that it transcends based on any kind of divine determination to break in. Desire, perhaps. Determination, not so much. Yes, it transcends many who are oppressed, which is by design. But I think the divine, perhaps to a debatable degree, is as subject to and affected by the rituals of what we do in relation to one another. In other words, the spirit of liberation can be choked out of a situation, and we have seen the evidence. But I believe that play actually generates spirit. As spirit exists with us, affected by what happens to us, but relying on the collaboration among us to break in with new ideas, beliefs, and performances that ultimately bring about new realities. But we bear the responsibility to disrupt, to play, to hold space for newness to be born, as opposed to going headlong into reality as it is. Spirit, understand as a kind of wind or water waiting for an ocean. Sprouts of green life that find cracks in the pond. Those spaces, the unforeseen possibility that break open all of a sudden and you don't say that. 2 examples come to mind as I talked about Birth of a Nation earlier, which was right at the beginning of a film revolution that was credited for creating a resurgence of the KKK and reinstating this image of beast publicly. And you hold that intention with this image right here, Black Panther. I remember how moved I was watching this movie, talking about the possibilities of play. And not only seeing a Black superhero, and then after that, seeing Black children choose to be a Black superhero for Halloween, which was something that I did not grow up seeing. But seeing the way that this film, this form of play, actually has begun to create a reality that we are bringing to fruition. But I was so impressed by not only the imagery, but the use of imagination to construct a world that is the use of imagination to construct a world that exists completely outside of even those little small relational interactions. You might remember the scene or those norms of relational interactions that relate to these scripts that I'm talking about. You might remember the scene when the white man was visiting Wakanda and he spoke out of turn, and they basically were like, "We don't do that here." And the way that that turned on its head, a norm of who gets to speak first and when, of whose voice is authoritative and how. The detail in this film creates a possibility of seeing the world differently. And to go back to the kind of the relational piece that I did not spend much time on, you think about how imagination is not off limits when it comes to oppression. And the possibility born from this play for what a Black boy or girl might imagine about themselves and then consequently live into. Another story, when I was home in San Antonio the last time, Monica, my wife, was working with, conspiring with my best friend's wife, my best friend Brandon, to fly me down there to surprise him for his birthday. And his wife Ryan told me that they go to this cigar bar Friday night, and you should probably just show up there. I walk in, and he's of course surprised, but I walk in and there's 5 or 6 Black men just sitting around in what I would call as places, and thinking together about possibilities, about how to share resources to create futures for young Black men and women, thinking together about ways to challenge ourselves. I can remember a story one of the brothers said about even the language we use. And I was convicted by his wise counsel that not only do we need to stop using one of the cultural signifiers that we have claimed for ourselves in the N-word, and I knew that, but he also talked about the importance of, we need to actually stop saying boy to each other also. And if you know me and my cousins, it's what's up, my boy. And it's a term of endearment. But again, those little subtle plays of politics that allow and participate in the recreation of ways of assuming about us. Now, I'm not saying it's automatic. The point is this: as I thought about that space, that it was unencumbered, there was no external or political demand, there was nowhere we needed to be, there was nothing we needed to produce, there was no pressure. It was not bearing down on us, but this was a play space that we got to have for ourselves. And the growth and the healing and the potential revolution and transformation that begins in a space like that. I conclude by just saying simply, just give us space. We're serious about Black men thriving and being able to live into the possibilities that we have as human beings. And of course, there are structural implications to giving Black men space to play. But we know how to feel. There's embodied brilliance that can bore new reality. Just give us space.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Green, for inspiring, interrogating, making us quake a little bit as we think about these possibilities.